Thank you, David. Thank you for that very warm welcome. PowerPoint presentation. Kind of feel like I need to apologise up front, but let's get going. So for those of you who don't know, and David gave us a very good introduction, but those of you who don't know DDI, we are a global leadership consulting organisation, and in essence our area of focus and our area of expertise is pretty much squarely in the area of leadership. And ultimately we're here trying to help organisations, but also to help leaders like you to be more effective at their roles. As David mentioned, we've been doing this for about 50 years, but across that period of time, the business and leadership landscape has changed dramatically. And it's changed particularly dramatically in the last 10 years or so. A few years ago, the term VUCA found its way into the business sort of lexicon. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And this was kind of used to describe the conditions and the characteristics of the environment that organisations are operating in. And certainly the description that Brand gave us a moment ago captured many of the elements of that. But it's not only the environment that organisations need to operate in, it's also the environment that leaders need to operate in as well and step up to. And so it would be fair to say that across that 50 years, but particularly over the last 10 years, with the dramatic change that we've seen in the business and leadership context, it is putting increasingly more pressure on leaders. The leader's job is getting pretty tough. And I think sometimes we forget that ultimately leadership is a human endeavour, and that behind every leader is a person who's trying to make the most of the challenges and opportunities that they confront. And we sometimes as an industry tend to focus too much on the failings of leaders and the lack of readiness of leaders. A few years ago, we did some research with leaders, and we asked them to rank and rate a number of life challenges that they often face. And this included things like dealing with a bereavement, dealing with divorce, managing teenagers, which I can say I've gone through and survived, to understand how important those life changes were to them. So why did we as a leadership company ask them about these particular challenges? Because we wanted to understand how big a challenge in their life leadership was, and in particular, the transition that we often make into one level of leadership, that first level of leadership, but also through our career as leaders. And what we found was that, in fact, making a transition at work into that first leadership role and even beyond that into more senior leadership roles was the most difficult life challenge that many leaders confronted. Now, I'm not about to suggest that a leadership challenge is as difficult as dealing with bereavement or dealing with a family illness, etc. But what it does highlight is how difficult the role of leadership can be. And as I said a moment ago, sometimes we tend to focus too much on the failings of leaders and the lack of readiness. And this became particularly personal for me a couple of years ago. This is a picture of my daughter, Kelsey, and you can probably tell by the accent, from Australia. And Kelsey was studying event management at university and was lucky enough to pick up a part-time job at a local convention centre. So it was an opportunity to actually start to learn and apply a number of things that she was doing at university. And things were going really well. She was getting great feedback from her managers. The customers were delighted with the experience and her service. She was forming great relationships with her team members, the people that she was working with, creating friendships. And then one evening, Kelsey came home. And this was about 3 months into the job, so relatively soon into kind of really making the move into the workplace. And she announced to me that she had been asked to take on her first leadership job at this function centre. And so you can imagine, as both a father, but also as a practitioner in the field of leadership, I was both thrilled and I was incredibly proud. And then I saw the fear in her eyes. She was genuinely petrified by the proposition of transitioning and moving into that first leadership job. And it was all the things that I knew about. It was the things like suddenly having to manage now all those friends, those people that had been your former peers, your friends, having to manage them. It was about having to take responsibility for now running these events and making the decisions that would have a profound impact on the quality of the event and the experience of the people that was going through it. And it was also about how to motivate others. Up to that point in time, a relatively short point in time, all Kelsey had needed to do was to manage herself and motivate herself. She didn't need to worry about motivating others. And this moment was a stark reminder of how difficult the transition into leadership can be, but also more broadly, how the overall role of leadership can be. And so it's really about how do we start to think differently about how we're supporting leaders as they're making that transition and moving into roles. Now, as I said a moment ago, things like the VUCA environment is changing dramatically, but there's a number of other forces of change that we've seen over the last 10 years as well, which means that the role of leadership is getting harder. And it's things like, we'd heard a lot about this from what Bram was saying, work is being radically reduced. We're being asked to kind of speed up. We're being asked to make decisions very, very quickly, judgments very, very quickly. And the decisions that we once saw as the domain of senior leaders and the executives within an organisation are increasingly being pushed down to lower levels within the organisations. So whether you're a mid-level leader or whether you're a frontline level leader, you're being asked to make decisions that will have a profound impact on the strategic priorities and cultural priorities of your organisation. We've also seen dramatic change in terms of the structures within organisations. Historically, we had very defined structures based on hierarchy, where the dominant characteristic was positional power. Hence the term supervisor, I tell you what to do. But that again has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. What we've seen now is that organisations are required to get things done, and leaders in particular are required to get things done through others, often without that positional power. So that requires influence. And it requires the ability to leverage your personal power, not just your positional power. And the expectations of the people we manage have changed as well across that last 10 years. We've seen dramatic changes in terms of their expectations. They want meaning in their work. They want to be able to make a meaningful contribution. They want to be able to make impact. They want a sense of purpose from the organisation and a sense of purpose in what they're doing. And they also have very different expectations about the kind of organisation and the kind of leadership that they're looking for as well. They're looking for things like greater balance in their life. They're looking for greater access to information, transparency within their organisations. And they're also asking for and looking for opportunities to grow and develop. And leaders are being asked to create the environment and the conditions that support those expectations. But leaders themselves are also facing enormous change and are in a constant state of transition. It used to be that leaders within an organisation were asked to manage the change across an organisation or lead the transformation across an organisation. But today, most leaders find themselves participants in that change process as well. So they're not only being asked to lead a change or lead a transformation, they're having to deal with the uncertainty themselves as participants in the change process. So with all this change going on and the role getting tougher, how do we better support leaders as they move forward? Well, one way to think about it is what's currently getting in the way. What is the thing that is getting in the way for leaders as they confront these challenges in the context and the business and leadership environment? And if I was to sort of get you to kind of yell out a few things, my guess is I'd be pretty confident that one of the things that would typically come out is time. Time is one of our biggest challenges in the workplace today, finding the time to get things done, finding the time to move things forward with the kind of challenges and the pressures that we face. And in fact, I found myself often running these kinds of workshops, and we do a lot of leadership development workshops with our clients, and we'll share with them a range of different skills and practices and frameworks that they might be able to use. And at the end of that session, I'll often ask the question, so what's the thing that is going to stop you or prevent you from actually applying these? Because more often than not, they recognise the value of them. They can see how these sorts of skills are going to help, how these frameworks will assist them. But when I ask the question, what is going to get in the way? I would say 70% of the time, the response I get back is time. And here's the funny thing about time. Despite the fact that we like to think we might be able to manage and control time, and despite the fact that we have this incredible fascination with things like time travel and things like turning back time, did you know, you probably do as an audience, but there's something like 50 scientific studies done every year on the issue of time travel. We have this deep fascination with time, and in fact, some would argue that time has become the new weather. We're always talking about time. But at this point in time, at least, we don't have that ability to control time. And we certainly don't have the luxury of the Bill Murray Groundhog Day, where we can revisit the day before and correct all the bad decisions and actions that we took. And what this does is this creates time pressure. And time pressure is a real and genuine psychological condition that we need to deal with. And when we feel a sense of time pressure, it leads us as leaders and as individuals often to make some bad choices about how we use our time. And as leaders, these are some of the things we sometimes tend to do. We tend to focus on the things that are urgent rather than the things that are important. So we'll put our emphasis on the thing that is right in front of us now. We've all kind of lived with that email that pops up, even though we know we should be focusing on something that's a little bit more longer term or is likely to add more longer term value. The moment that email pops up, it becomes a distraction. So we tend to focus on those things that are urgent rather than important. When making decisions or exploring issues, we often tend to narrow our focus and narrow the options that we might consider. And again, we often do that because to explore further, to consider more options, might take time. So we narrow our options, and therefore the quality of our decisions and judgments can sometimes be not as good as if we'd taken more time. And in our relationships with particularly our people, our team members, and with others across an organisation, and sometimes even with our customers, for example, we lack a true presence. When you're in that meeting, having a conversation with somebody, more often than not, what you're doing is thinking about the conversation you just had or thinking about the conversation you're about to have. And as a result, you're not truly present in the moment with the person that you are actually meeting with. And here's an interesting one. Despite the pressure of time, one of the things we tend to do as leaders when we're facing time pressure is we actually take on more and share less. And we do that often because we kind of face that situation, which is, for me to bring this other person up to speed, to get them ready to take on that task, it's going to take too long. So it's probably easier if I do it myself. And then finally, one of the key things we tend to do as leaders and as individuals in the workplace when we're faced with time pressure is we neglect our own personal growth. And we don't invest enough time in how we intend to grow ourselves as leaders. So what we want to share with you today is a bit of a framework for how you can use your time and make a more meaningful investment of your time as a leader, and share with you 3 different horizons that are critical to the success of a leader. And it's all attached to what we refer to as Leadership 480, and this magic number that you will all see in a moment of 480. Now, we're going to go into each of these in a little bit more depth. Katy's going to talk a little bit more about a couple of these horizons, and I'm going to talk about one. But let me just kind of set this up to start with and give you a little bit of an overview. So the first horizon is 480 minutes. And 480 minutes represents a kind round about 8 hours, which is the average day. I know many of you probably work a lot longer than that, but don't get too hung up on that. And you think about the moments that you experience across a single day and the profound impact that those moments could have on you personally, have on your people, have on your teams, and have on your organisations. Think about that hallway conversation that you might have had yesterday, that at the time felt like a relatively quick and minor conversation. But depending on how the other person approached and interpreted that, they could have walked away feeling excited, satisfied with the response that they got, or they could also walk away feeling pretty frustrated, angry, and maybe disengaged. And as a result, could be a loss of productivity, or even worse, they've gone back to their desk, they've opened up their internet browser, and they've looked up the local recruitment site to see what might be a next opportunity. So across any day, we have, across these 480 minutes, an immense number of critical leadership moments that as a leader, we need to be able to step up to. So as a leader, you need to be asking yourself, to what extent am I prepared to take on and step up to those critical leadership moments? Do I have the skills across every day that I operate as a leader to deal with the majority of those critical leadership moments? The second horizon is 480 days. And 480 days represents around about 2 years, which in today's business context is the typical horizon that you will see in organisations for a business strategy or a business priority. So that might be something like opening a new market, or it might be something like driving process efficiency across an organisation, or it might be a priority around driving product innovation. And again, you need to be thinking about, in the context of that 2 years, to what extent are you prepared to support the priorities within your organisation? Because as a leader, you have a responsibility not only to your people, but to your organisation, and to actually support and align with what the organisation is trying to do in terms of its key priorities. So do you have the skills that will help and support the achievement of those critical business priorities? And the third horizon is 480 months. And 480 months represents around about 40 years, which is the typical career of somebody in the workforce. And again, across that 480 months, the question is, to what extent are you constantly thinking about the career that you have as a leader? Do you view your role as a leader as part of your profession? Are you looking to grow, to develop, to move towards the next level of leadership, or to get yourself ready to accelerate towards those more senior levels of leadership? So let me ask a question. Across those three horizons, 480 minutes, 480 days, and 480 months, and it's a little bit hard to see, but which one do you think is the most important? Is it the minutes, the days, the months, or is it all of the above? Let me see a show of hands for the minutes. Okay, what about the days? All right, what about the months? What about all of the above? Cool. Majority of you tended to highlight all of the above. Those that didn't, I suspect what you're looking at is where your focus is at the moment and what are the kind of priorities that you're facing. The reality is you should be thinking about all three horizons concurrently. Now, at any point in time, you might put a little bit more emphasis around one particular horizon, but you need to be thinking about leadership in the context of how am I supporting each of those three horizons. So we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the things that we see as the most critical elements for you to consider as a leader against each of those three horizons. So let me hand over to Katy. Katy's going to talk a little bit about those 480 minutes and 480 days. Then I'll come back and talk about the 480 months.
All right.
Katy.
Thank you. Thank you. Well done. Oh, thank you. So my name is Katy Campbell, and I am a PowerPoint user. I feel so much better to get that out in the open. I want to start our conversation about the 480 minutes, that first time on our time frame, on our horizon, and talk about what it means to leaders and what it means to you. And I think that what it means is that we have to be very cognizant and very mindful about the interactions that we're having every day. And sometimes these are very small interactions and very routine conversations. And we tend to sometimes think of them as one-offs, or we don't really think of them at all. It's just what we do. But the truth is, there is a lot of power in how you communicate and the words that you use, and that's especially true at the leadership level. And I'll bet you there's somebody, if not a lot of people in this audience, who can remember one thing that a boss said to you at some point that just stuck in your head, just took residence right in there, because it was either so powerful and inspiring that you can't forget it, or it was really discouraging. So anybody have that memory? Me too. And my memory is when I was first out of college, my first job was in a retail store, and the retail chain is very well known for growing their own leaders and promoting from within. And so about a year into the job, I talked to my manager and I said, what does my career path look like? And she said, Katy, well, you're not management material. Well, it's okay. I did okay later. But the point is, it changed the course of my career, right? Because I didn't work there very much longer, and I decided to go to graduate school, and I decided to move on. But that was a very important thing that she said to me, and I guarantee you that she doesn't remember saying it, and neither do any of your bosses, right? And so that's why it's so important that we be cognizant, and as Mark said, we're present in those conversations. We're going to talk a little bit about how we can do that and how we can hone our skill for those 480 minutes. But before we get started, I want to ask you a polling question, and that is, when we think about leadership success, or when you think about your own leadership success, do you think it's due more to IQ and technical skills or emotional intelligence, or what we call EQ? And so if you think it has more to do with IQ, just raise your hand. Anybody? There are no takers on IQ. All right. How about emotional intelligence? All right, good. You are so correct. There was a researcher named Daniel Goleman, and his name is sort of synonymous with emotional intelligence, and he set out to answer this question. And what he found was that across all jobs, emotional intelligence is actually twice as important as technical skills and IQ. And so do you think that this figure changes for leadership jobs? Yes? Everybody? Yes, no? Well, it does change, and it's really quite astounding. So in leadership jobs, success is correlated 85% to the use of EQ, and only 15% to IQ or technical skills. So what this tells me is that the IQ and the technical skills were really the price of admission, right? That's what got you into that leadership position because you're smart and you're good at your job. But to have success staying in that leadership position, there's a whole new skill set to learn, that emotional side, that emotional intelligence. So when you think about the conversations that you have every day, you probably have no fewer than a dozen, maybe you have twice as many, and those are opportunities that are very powerful. So in every conversation, you should be thinking about two needs that you need to address in every interaction, every conversation, every meeting that you lead. And those are the practical needs and the personal needs of the conversation. And the practical needs are the objectives that you need to accomplish in a conversation. Is this conversation a planning conversation? Are we designing a new process? What are we doing? That's the practical need. Easy enough, right? But there's another need in the room. In every pair or every meeting, there are personal needs that every person has and every person brings with them. And personal needs are universal. We all have them, and they're things like the need to feel respected, the need to feel valued, the need to feel that our opinion counts. Those are personal needs, and we all have them. And so while we're having these conversations, we need to be attending to the practical needs of getting the work done, but also to the personal needs of the people in the room. Because if we don't attend to personal needs, respect, value, listening, letting people know that they've been heard, what's going to happen? People are going to disengage, right? We're never going to get to the practical needs of the conversation because you're slowly losing your audience, right? Because you're not attending to the fact that they need to be heard, they need to feel like they've been listened to, they need to feel valued. And if you think about it, it's not very common for people to leave their jobs because practical needs weren't met. So I didn't leave my job because my boss wasn't particularly good at execution, but I might have left my job because my boss didn't value me, didn't listen to me, didn't understand a thing I said, and didn't value my work. Those would be good reasons to leave your job, right? And that's how people get disengaged and decide to move on. Or maybe your boss told you that you weren't management material. That's another reason too. All right. So what is the one interaction skill that you can start using right away to meet people's personal needs? It is what we call empathy. Empathy is the most important skill in any conversation. It's the most important thing that can happen. And empathy is the ability to walk in someone else's shoes, to appreciate what they're saying, to feel the feelings, to appreciate the feelings, but maybe sometimes we will even feel them too, and empathize with that person, walk in their shoes. But empathy is not just a feeling. Empathy is something that needs to be articulated. It needs to be expressed. We have to, in these conversations, to meet personal needs, we have to express empathy, or else the receiver won't know that they're being understood, or valued, or recognized. So when I said that empathy was the number one skill that's important, this is what I meant. What I've got up on the screen here is some research that DDI conducted a couple of years ago. And what we did was we went through a decade of leadership assessment data, and we correlated what skills correlate the highest with job success. So if you look down that left-hand side, there are a bunch of interaction skills. Empathy is the sixth one down. And across the top, you can see leadership behaviors or leadership competencies like coaching and planning and organizing and decision-making. And you can tell that empathy really wins the day here. Empathy is boss because empathy is highly correlated with success in all of those leadership competencies, higher than any other interaction skill. And you might say, well, okay, I understand the coaching part and I understand the engagement part. Those sound like though you might need some empathy to do those things, but what about decision-making and planning and organizing? Well, the interesting thing, I think, here is that even though those sound like they're a little bit harder skills or a little bit more technical, the fact is you won't be able to have a great planning and organizing discussion and get great results for planning and organizing or decision-making without having a great conversation where people's opinions and what they bring to the table are valued, pulled out, and appreciated and understood. So that's why it correlates really to everything that you do in leadership. Here's the bad news. Our research shows that only 40% of leaders are actually good at empathy. And that's because there's a big chasm between knowing something and saying something. And remember how I said that empathy needs to be expressed? It needs to be acted on? That's where people get hung up generally, is that I might know that you have, I might see on your face that you have a problem or that you are jubilant about something, but my knowing about it isn't enough because I have to say it. I have to recognize it and say, oh my gosh, you look like you're running from, I don't know, a ghost. You look so scared. What's going on? To show that I actually care and I understand what's going on with you. Or, oh, you look so relaxed after your vacation. That must have been a great time. Did you have fun? That's awesome. I have to express what I'm seeing and hearing from other people back to them so that they know that they're being understood. So how do we do it? How do we do it? Well, first we have to listen and we have to observe. We have to be present in the moment, as Mark was talking about. And then we have to respond. And here's what we really need to do when we're responding with empathy, is we need to respond to the fact of what's going on and also the feeling that accompanies that. So for example, this is a perfect empathy statement. It's clear that these last-minute changes, that's the fact, have caused frustration, that's a feeling, for the team. Now, once I acknowledge that and I get that out on the table, you as my conversational partner can say, well, no, that's not really the problem, or yeah, it is a problem and we need to fix that, but we've taken care of the elephant in the room. We're getting it out there, right? We're surfacing it. And a lot of times people will say, oh man, I don't do that. I don't do empathy. And please don't make me talk about feelings. Is there any of that sentiment here? And the truth is, one of the reasons that we really want to do this is to show respect and to show that we're hearing and understanding someone. But we also want to do it because empathy is not to dwell on emotion. It's not about getting wrapped around the axle on emotional stuff. It's about acknowledging it so we can move on. And if you've ever been in a meeting with someone who has very strong feelings about something and they're not being acknowledged, what does that person do? They keep running at it, right? They keep trying to make that case, and then you can never get off of it. So think about this as a way to acknowledge and move through it, okay? Another thing to think about is, people don't always talk about their feelings, but sometimes you can see them. So look for those visual clues. And also, empathize with positive things too. So this doesn't have to be doom and gloom. This can be, hey, I see by the look on your face that congratulations are in order. Good job on that survey, on the survey results. You're talking about the fact and the feeling that accompanies it. And that makes people feel like, oh my gosh, in that moment of time, that person understood what was going on with me. And it can be very, very powerful. And I want to leave you with this quote. This is from a book by Alan Burdick. And he says, empathy is a fairly sophisticated trait. It's a mark of emotional adulthood. It takes learning and time. And I want to leave you with this because I think there are a lot of people who think, I wasn't born with that. I don't do that because I'm not that kind of person. I'm not warm and fuzzy. Well, it's not really warm and fuzzy, the fact and the feeling, right? It is something that needs to be learned, and it is a skill, after all. It's not really a personality trait. It's a skill that we can all learn and work into our conversations to let people know that we understand them and that they're being heard. I promise you, if you have not used this before or for a long time, try it. Try it in your conversations at work or at home. Test it out, see what happens. I promise you, you will have good results because this is a skill that actually changes people's lives, both the deliverer and the receiver of the empathy. So please try that out. And now I'm going to move on to that second horizon, which is the 480 days, and that's the time that we have to execute on our company's priorities. Now, 480 days is basically like a 2.5-year life cycle. And it seems like a lot. It seems like we have a very long runway to execute on whatever goals we have to execute on. But the truth is that one quarter slips by and another quarter slips by, and we've found ourselves getting further and further away from those goals. And that's usually because of the day-to-day, right? My heart was in the right place. I meant to work on that goal, but I have this day job that keeps me really busy. And so the goal here is to get closer and closer and closer to those goals, to really understand them, to understand how we can contribute to them, and how we might get derailed, what we might bring to the table that might get us derailed and get us off course. So in your 480 days, you probably have a lot of goals that you need to meet, a lot of strategic goals. Some of them are up on the screen. You might be asked to create a new culture. You might be asked to drive profitability or innovation. Those are big goals, and maybe you're being asked to do all of them. The thing is, you will not be perfectly suited for every goal that you need to achieve. And that's just the fact. Because leadership is not a static thing, it's very contextual. Different projects, different goals take different skills, right? So some goals you'll meet very easily, and then some you might struggle with. The idea here is let's get in front of the goal and find out what we bring to the table that will make us either wildly successful or what might derail us, such as personality traits and things like that. Let's get in front of it and do some planning in advance before we end up at the end of those 480 days and we haven't gotten done what we want to. So I'm going to put 5 questions up on the screen. I'm going to give you ample time to take your pictures. These are 5 really important questions to ask yourself. When you're facing those goals or any other challenges or projects, what am I required to do? So what is it, and how am I going to do it? And what do I bring that enables me to do it effectively, and what do I bring that could derail me? And those are the 2 I just want to focus on as I close up here. When I want to do an investigation of how I can contribute to a project, I use a little tool that I've made up, and it's called My Success Profile. And I usually just draw a quadrant, and I list out my experiences or what I have done that can help me in this challenge, meet this goal. And my experience can be anything like job experience or projects I've worked on, anything like that. My knowledge, what I know. So do I have an industry knowledge that will help me? Do I have an educational background that's going to help me here? And as I'm doing that, I'm also identifying the gaps, right? What What do I need to know that I don't know? What experiences do I need that I don't have? And then I focus on the skills. And the skills are things like coaching, delegating, meeting leadership, decision-making, planning and organizing, any kind of competencies or skill sets that I have that are going to help me out here. And again, where are my gaps? What do I need to be working on? And then last, personal attributes. And personal attributes are so interesting because we're really talking about personality factors and what kind of a person am I? What do I like? What are the conditions under which I like to work? What are the things I like to do? What are some characteristics or some ways that people would describe me? And I put those in the personal attributes box. Now you might be wondering, why does it matter? Why does my personality matter in relative to organizational goals? Well, because my personality traits, or how I like to work, or how I do work, have a lot to do with whether I'll be very successful on a project, or those personality traits could very easily be my derailers. So for example, I personally am a very creative person, and I promise you, you want me in every brainstorming meeting that you have. Because I have ideas, I know how we should do things, it's really great. That is a good thing to have, but contextually, sometimes that can take me off track. Maybe I want us to keep fixing things after we're too far down the road with a decision. Or maybe I just want to talk about the idea, but I don't really want to execute on it because that's not really my thing. In those situations, that's what I need to bring to the surface, be self-aware of, so that I can exercise some extra discipline when I do have to execute, or when I do have to keep my mouth shut and tell the good idea fairy to go away. So that's an exercise worth doing for your 480 days. And now Mark's going to take over for the 480 weeks. Months. Sorry.
Thanks, Katy. I'm conscious of... And a well-deserved applause as well. I'm going to kind of finish off talking a little bit about the 480 months. And I'm a little conscious of we're already behind time, so I'm going to move through this a little bit quicker. The 480 months represents around about a 40-year career. And the problem is that too often we tend to get so busy, focused on the day-to-day, that we often don't step back and think about our longer-term careers and how we're preparing ourselves for the next challenge, the leadership challenge, or the accelerating towards those more senior roles. And we often find ourselves in a rut, and we often joke about that. And we talk about it as things like midlife crisis, where we go off and buy a sports car or an apartment by the beach, or we might end up in one of those life challenges that we talked about a little bit earlier as well. And the problem is we're not growing. And that's why we find ourselves in these ruts. And so we need to be constantly thinking about how do we grow. And I'm not suggesting you can plan out a 40-year career, but perhaps we need to be thinking more regularly about how we continue to grow and build our career as leaders. And there's a strong connection here to the theme of the conference, which is the evolution of you. What are you doing to think about on a regular basis how you're growing your career, not only from a technical perspective, but also how you're growing your career as a leader? And two things I want to talk about in the context of a career as a leader. And the first one relates to what extent do you view leadership as a profession and as a craft? And the second thing is, what is the mindset that you bring to the role of leadership? The debate about leadership, is it born, is it made, is it something we can develop, is over. As Katy mentioned a moment ago, we all bring certain predispositions that will probably set us up for certain types of activities, or even set us up for certain types of roles. And some of us might bring certain predispositions and characteristics that might be more aligned to a leadership role. But the reality is that debate is over. leadership in any context requires focus, requires development, requires growth. And so you need to be investing in leadership in the same way that you would be investing in your growth in any other professional discipline. So one of the first questions you need to ask yourself is, do I treat leadership as a profession? Do I treat leadership as a craft? Or is it something that is attached to my regular day job or attached to my regular profession? And I often use this little test. You don't see these things very often these days, becoming a little bit obsolete. But these are kind of a departure card. It's actually an outgoing passenger card from my home country, Australia. And often on those departure cards, you're asked to write down what is your usual occupation. Now, quick show of hands, how many of you in the room are actually leaders, whether a front, supervisor or a more senior leader? Yeah, there's quite a few of you in the room. So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. How many of you, when you have to complete one of these departure cards, writes down, my usual occupation is leader? Probably not. And I'm as guilty as you as well. Even though if you're in a leadership role, that probably accounts for the majority of your responsibilities these days. And it's a little test, but it's an important test, because what it does is it says that we are still connected and often attached to our foundation professional discipline, whether that be as an engineer, whether that be as an economist or an HR practitioner. We still attach ourselves to that foundation rather than viewing and treating the role of leadership as a craft and a profession that we need to be focused on and we need to continue to grow and develop. So that's the first thing. Think about, how do you think about the role of leadership? Do you view it as a profession? And if you do, how do you look at it in the context of continuing to grow? The second thing is the mindset that you bring. And I would say I've been kind of working with DDI now 16 years, and I do a lot of work with leaders around coaching, and we do a lot of assessment of leaders, trying to understand where their strengths are, where their gaps are, ultimately trying to help them grow as leaders. And I would say probably the most important quality or characteristic that leads to success is the mindset that an individual brings to the role of leadership. And you could probably argue this is to any particular role, but particularly in the context of leadership. And more specifically, do they bring a fixed mindset or do they bring a growth mindset? And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And this draws on the work of Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck is a Stanford professor. For 20 years, she's been studying how beliefs, both conscious beliefs and unconscious beliefs, contribute to success in a whole range of different life domains, whether that be parenting, whether that be sport, whether that be education, or whether that be at work. And what Carol Dweck found is that those who bring a growth mindset are more likely to be successful. Now, a growth mindset is associated with people who do believe that capabilities can be developed. And therefore, what they do is they embrace challenges. They embrace those setbacks that Bran talked about earlier, not as failures, but as opportunities to grow. And therefore, they do seek out opportunities to grow as well. Whereas those people who bring a fixed mindset tend not to be as successful. And those with a fixed mindset believe that capability is static or skills are static. It's not something that we can change or grow. And therefore, they avoid challenges and obstacles, and perhaps they ignore opportunities. And the other thing that Dweck's work found is that context matters when we think about mindset. So we don't just have one mindset, which is we either have a fixed or a growth mindset. That in different situations and different contexts, we will bring a certain mindset. So you might have a growth mindset in terms of your foundation profession of engineering, electrical engineering, electronics engineering, but in the context of leadership, you might bring a fixed mindset. But she also found that we can change that, and we can switch on and off the type of mindset that we bring to certain contexts and situations, if we're prepared to really understand the beliefs that we bring to the role. So those two things, first of all, in the context of those 480 months, that career you have as a leader, Am I thinking about leadership as a profession that I need to grow and develop in the same way that I develop in other areas? And do I bring the mindset that will allow me to flourish and be successful as a leader? So what we've talked about today across these three horizons of 480 minutes, 480 days, and 480 months, as I say, is really giving you a framework, not just whether you're in a leadership role, but even if you're thinking about it as an individual contributor or as a specialist in any particular field or discipline, is how do you use that time? How do I make a meaningful use of the time that I have, given that time is perhaps one of the greatest obstacles that I have, but also time represents probably the most precious resource that we have in our careers as well. I love this quote by Charles Fred from a relatively new book called The 24-Hour Rule. He says that pause should not be seen as a delay, that in fact a pause is a discipline. And it's one of the things that we're probably encouraging you to do today as you start to think about your future, whether that be as a leader or whether that be as a specialist in a particular field. Take this opportunity to pause, to think about how you're using your time, how you're making the investment of your time, and are you focusing on the right things at the right time. So with that, thank you very much for having us today. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I know I don't sound like I'm from Pittsburgh, but I've been living here in Pittsburgh for the last couple of years. So on behalf of DDI, who is based in Pittsburgh, welcome to our city. I love the city, actually. I've really fallen in love with it over the last couple of years. So I hope you get to enjoy it. You're going to love the cruise tonight, and therefore I'm very conscious of time, so I don't want to stop you from getting to that. So one little thing I'll put up on the screen. If you're interested in testing your mindset, whether it's a growth or fixed mindset, you can do a little quick quiz, and this will give you an answer to, particularly in the context of leadership and coaching, do you bring more of a growth mindset or do you bring more of a fixed mindset? Because that will actually have a significant impact on how you coach others as well. Thank you very much for having us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Katy.